Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to a breaking news edition of Your Encounter Today with really some frightening and impending news. But I believe that as we hear the truth, the church is going to respond appropriately. We have the latest updates on some pastors that have been jailed for simply having worship services. We're going to talk about what's coming. Are there going to be more arrests this weekend? Are there going to be more arrests in the weekend to come? What's happening in Canada? What's happening in the United States? And maybe even some updates on the front lines of the fight for life, because for too long we've been censored by organizations like the ACLU. We've been silenced by judges in black robes and a woke mob and media. We've been seduced by a twisted idea of tolerance and acceptance, and it's time for the church to find her voice. And we want to hear from you. Are you with us tonight? Put in the comments, let us know where you're watching from. And we have a guest with us tonight who's going to help us navigate these troubled waters. You know her. You've probably seen her on Rebel News, or you know about her work with the UN, and she's here on Encounter Today tonight. Would you welcome Mattea Merta with us on Encounter Today? Mattea, it's good to have you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're such a clear voice for truth, and for people who aren't following you on Instagram or wherever you can be followed, the links for your work is in the description of this video. We want people to connect with your ministry. But as a fierce advocate for life, and we're going to talk about what's happening on the front for the fight of life, breaking news in the United States of what's happening later on. But 2 years ago, would you have ever thought that the number one topic of conversation would be fighting for religious liberty?
To be honest, I could see it happening, not to the extent or in the means and ways that we're seeing today, but I could see it happening based upon the current trends of society. I mean, we just look at history and you can see kind of a playbook, step-by-step playbook being executed today. So the crackdown on freedom of speech, the fight for life, what we're seeing with churches, the buckling and the laying down of one's authority for a social or a woke gospel. It makes sense that you would see this kind of coming, but I definitely didn't expect it to come in the form of public health or safety.
Well, Time Magazine calls it one of the best nonfiction works of the 20th century. It's called The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and it's a documentation of a gentleman who was taken captive, put in the gulags under communist Marxist rule. And it's a frightening work because he opens the book talking about the disappearances, that people just here and there were being silenced one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. And people didn't speak up because they thought, well, it'll boil over. People will come to their senses. And it just progressed worse and worse. In fact, I think we have footage of Pastor Artur being arrested as he left his church by a SWAT team. Let's take a look at that real quick. It's really unbelievable to watch a pastor for having church service being arrested in the middle of a freeway, put on his knees, handcuffed, carried into the squad car. So what's been happening with Pastor Artur? What's happening? What's the updates with him? And then we'll get into what's happening with other pastors in Canada.
For sure. So he was in jail for about 48 hours, and then he was finally released. And there was a lot of ups and downs with the conditions in which he was going to be released, his bail, and he was arrested unlawfully, just as all of the other pastors were. But there's a court case coming up. A contempt of court case where he potentially breached, but that, of course, is going to be determined within the next couple of days here. Now, Pastor Pawlowski and his brother David were both hauled off to the remand center is what it's called. It's a maximum security facility simply for holding church, for preaching. And something people have to understand about Pastor Pawlowski is he grew up behind the Iron Curtain.
Yes.
He understands the symptoms of the times. He's He's lived under communism and an oppressive regime, so he gets it. And this is why, as he was being hauled off, you hear him yelling, "You Nazis, you Nazis," because he understands what he's witnessing, and he's living it yet again. He fled communism for Canada, for safety, and he's experiencing it here. So he is going to be launching a court case against the government of Alberta for how he was not only treated, but also it could bring up the fact that it could try, rather, the various health authorities and how they've been treating the Albertan people with their unjustifiable health orders,
but
which
he was
completely
released.
contradict. He was released, yes, but he still has another court date to go where he could still be slapped with fines.
Even in the midst of this mindless government overreach, the pressure that people like you and ministries have put on the government caused him really to be released, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, it's a mobilization. A lot of people, thankfully, I mean, we've tried for years to activate Canadians to go out into their communities and to actually advocate for issues. But when it strikes so close to home, as an innocent pastor who is preaching and he's thrown in jail, that really hits home with many Canadians. And it's interesting. I was talking to a couple of acquaintances of mine who are actually atheists, and they were actually calling upon the government to also release this pastor. So it's not just people of faith, but people without a faith, or even other faiths, who I know a couple of individuals who are also Jewish, who are also calling upon the government. Now, that's not normal in Canadian society. Everybody's quite apathetic. Now, that's a generalization, of course, but there's a lot of apathetic Christians, a lot of apathetic Canadians. So it was really, really cool to see so many people advocating on behalf of these pastors.
This has got to be one extreme pastor, who's going against the government, and they're overreaching, yes, but that's not happening to other pastors in Canada, is it?
Oh, it absolutely is. You know what? We've had 3 pastors imprisoned in Canada thus far. So, one is a concern. It's kind of an anomaly. 2 is concerning, heightened concern, but 3 is a trend. And so we have Pastor James Coates, who was the first. Then we have Pastor Artur Pawlowski. And then we also have Pastor Tim Stevens out of Calgary as well. And there are other pastors like Pastor Jacob Rahum out of Ontario, who had his church was padlocked, his private property was seized, and his church has over $50 million in fines against it. And himself as a person, as an individual, has nearly, if not over, $900,000 in fines against him, simply for holding a church service. And it's interesting because most people don't understand that these public health orders they do not have the same authority as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which, for anyone watching who's not in Canada, that's a part of our constitutional rights as Canadians, and it's a protected right, and that supersedes any kind of public health orders, which is what is being used to actually attack Canadians' rights and freedoms. So it's interesting to watch. Now, I know a couple other pastors who, for example, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Pastor Steve Flippin of a Baptist church, his church has over 20 something or odd. I don't know how many fines, thousands of dollars more they were fined this past Sunday, but they have probably close to 30,000, if not more, in fines against them. And then the pastor and the elders have fines against them as well. Pastors and churches out in Montreal, Quebec, as well as all throughout Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba. These pastors, and I would actually be amiss not to mention Pastor Henry Hildebrandt out in Ontario as well. I was about to ask you about
him. Yeah, what happened with him?
Yes. So it was interesting to watch. I actually watched the church service where they were holding church, and the police entered their building, disrupted a service, which, for anybody watching, is actually in violation of the Canadian Criminal Code, Section 176. For a church service in progress to be interrupted. So these police entered the church service. They came up and said, "You all have to leave," and they were ticketed on their way out. The congregants plus the ministers. Their church property was seized and has been padlocked, so they cannot enter their building anymore. And now, just like Pastor James Coates, the pastor of Grace Life Church in Edmonton, Alberta, Pastor Henry Hildebrand, they're both holding these underground church services now out in large plots of land or in various undisclosed buildings. And this is how they're going about church these days, is by, communicating with their flock. You know what, we're going to meet at this time at this location. We might have to change it because the cops might show up.
Wow.
So this is the reality of what's happening in Canada, because people refuse to, place God above government, or excuse me, government above God, and follow the directives of the government instead of what the Word of God dictates we must follow.
Yeah, after working with the underground church in China and Pakistan, what you're describing for me, Mattea, sounds exactly like how these churches operate. We would go into services that are only planned a week in advance. They secretly message their members. When you go into the service, you got to tell everyone where the exits are in case the police come in. It's just mind-boggling to me now that we're talking about this happening in Canada. So this is really a trend we're seeing now across the nation, and it's moving further and further south as politicians grab for power. What's the church to do in a situation like this? What's the Canadian church doing in response?
Well, it's interesting to watch a lot. I know a lot of pastors and who have taken sides, because there's a clear line that's been drawn in the sand. And so there's pastors, for example, who are saying, you know what, we value our seat at the table with our local city council, and we want to keep that seat at the table because we value it and we actually get to speak into city council. Well, one, I can say that seat at the table means nothing. It's just pure pandering. But there's also those who are saying that this is nothing, these are temporary measures, so we're just going to go along with it. Now, that's one side. Mm-hmm. The other side, and of course, it's interesting to see the divide in who is standing where with regards to denominations. The Pentecostals are not standing up. The Baptists are. When it comes to, it's very interesting. So the people you expect to stand up are not standing up, and the people you at least expect standing up are. So based on denominational lines, it's primarily the Baptists, and even some Catholic churches are starting to stand up too in various provinces, depending on who the leader of that one parish is. Now, the other side are Christians. The remnant, I would say, who understand their rights and authorities, both as citizens of earth, but also ambassadors of heaven. And there's the one standing up. It's interesting too. I know so many believers who have left their churches because it's all on Zoom, and they're desiring to worship as mandated by God as a corporate body. And they're the ones who are primarily pushing back against this. It's not necessarily what I would call I don't want to say the hierarchy of the church, but the leadership of churches who are standing up. It's actually the body itself who is standing up and not just advocating for freedom and for their rights, and pushing the leadership of their churches to also stand up, reopen, and assert their authority. But, it's really disheartening to see when pastors are not even listening to their congregations. A lot of pastors are directed by a board. And I completely understand that. I totally understand that. But even the board is saying, no, we need to have our tax exemption, and we need to maintain certain social rights with our local governing authorities. And we just don't want to rock the boat. And so people in the church are becoming more and more disenfranchised with the leadership, which is sad to see. But at the same time, those individuals are starting house churches.
Yes.
And those house churches are growing. I know one that started back in January with 5 people in the basement of a home. And that church has grown to over 50 people. And more people just keep hearing. And that kind of puts a pressure on different pastors, different churches, and that's starting to wake them up, thankfully, to start taking a stand. But not very many people just don't like controversy. That's just human psychology. And so when you see pastors who, are being pressured both by the government and by their people, that's when things start to shift and change, because they want to keep their flock. They want to keep their tax exemption, but people are starting to have to figure out, what is more valuable.
Yeah.
Both to the kingdom, and at the end of the day, it should just be kingdom. We live for an audience of one as believers. So it's interesting to watch. I'm not too sure where things are going to go necessarily. I know several parishes that are looking to open up, and lots of other churches are finding out that they actually have legal standing. For example, based upon this one church in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, who had the largest fine in Canada thrown against it, a $14,000 fine slapped against the church simply for not having homeless people. It's a church primarily for homeless people. They weren't going to mask up people when they were singing. And so they got a $14,000 fine, and the court just had that fine tossed out. And because of that, that was within the last day or so. Because of that one instance, I know a couple other churches who are like, oh, we can actually probably open up now because these court challenges mean nothing. These fines mean absolutely nothing. So we're going to probably see a little bit more tension when it comes to churches reopening in Canada. But we're also starting to see, governments being very coercive and saying, well, once we reach a certain number of vaccinations within our provinces, we're going to start easing the restrictions. So churches are also waiting for that to come into play. When vaccinations, for example, in Saskatchewan reach 70%, churches are going to be able to gather at 150 people in a building. And so church pastors are advocating for church members to go get vaccinated. And they themselves are getting vaccinated all in an attempt to achieve or reach that 70% so that they themselves can actually gather.
Freedom conditioned on surrender is not freedom.
Precisely.
Freedom conditioned on surrender. And I know it seems reasonable, pastors, church leaders, board members, you just want to ride it out. You just want to ride out the situation, wait till everyone comes to their senses. The problem is, throughout history, no emergency power ever granted to the government was willingly given up. It's always had to be forcibly taken away. Do we see these restrictions? Do we see Canada, apart from the vaccinations, are things beginning to open up there? Because the science is telling us that you certainly can open up and that things weren't necessarily as they appeared the last year and a half. So what is Canada's position on that in general?
It's an interesting one because the provinces, various provinces, many of them are actually run by so-called conservative governments. They are pushing, first it was we need to flatten the curve, and then we need to make sure we're social distancing. We need everybody masked. They always kept moving the goalpost, and now it's to the point where we need to reach a certain number of vaccinations. So then what's next? What comes after the vaccinations, right? So it's going to be interesting to watch because at this point in time, the federal government, while provinces are saying, yeah, we need to have a certain number of vaccinations and we'll start reopening, the federal government is going, well, if we start easing restrictions, we're going to have a fourth wave. And people are not even buying that anymore. I was recently in Toronto, Ontario, which is one of the largest cities in Canada, if not the largest. And the people there are just living their lives. Nobody's really following the health orders imposed by Premier Doug Ford of Ontario. So people are done, and that's also one of the most liberal cities in Canada. And so I don't know how they're going to be able to continue on with their lockdowns, especially when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wants to call an election within the next couple months. So this is a normal tactic of governments all throughout history, is you impose a crisis as a government, and then you provide the solution, and then you restore freedoms for a period of time so that you appear to be the hero. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the trajectory that we're going down by June, July, August, that we end up having maybe possibly the Canada-US border reopen. And with that, they launch an election, a federal election. So Canada loves that we're a socialistic country. And socialism always leads to communism. Mm-hmm. So I would not be surprised that at some point in time, there is a fourth wave introduced because the variants were introduced a couple of months ago, and that caused a whole other slew of lockdowns across the country. So we'll see what happens, but governments just love their power right now. And So
Well, the
yeah,
question
that's all I can
is the
really
public
comment
going
on.
to bite? Is the public going to bite? Woke corporations have gotten away with it over the last year, but I think they're about to get to a place where they're going to start feeling it in their pocketbook, and they're not going to be so keen, hopefully, prayerfully, in lining up with these political scientists. But we've got some good news on the horizon. But before I talk about the good news in the fight for life, listen, ladies and gentlemen, now's the time to stay connected like no other time. Never allow censorship to stand between you and the voices that God has placed in your life. Go to encountertoday.com, sign up for the newsletter, so no matter what happens, we can always reach out to you with important information, news, prayer, prophetic words. We want to stay in contact with you. Go to encountertoday.com to get that information. Now, let's talk about some good news in the fight for life. There's been some breaking news in the state of Texas, where Governor Greg Abbott has signed a bill called the Heartbeat Bill. Can you tell us about that?
For sure. So the heartbeat bills have been introduced in many states across the United States. And this specific bill, it was signed into law. And basically, as soon as there is a heartbeat detected by a physician, abortion is no longer permitted. And that heartbeat can be detected at as early as 6 weeks, which means that abortion really becomes illegal at that point. And that's first trimester abortion is primarily the largest sum of women when they go to get an abortion, whether it's chemical or by any other means. So this is a huge feat that has been accomplished. Now, many other pro-life heartbeat bills have been shot down at the state level. They've been challenged and removed from the books. So that's one thing, that if you are in a state in the United States and your state proposed and signed into law a heartbeat bill, it probably has been revoked since then. So I'd encourage you to go look that up. But this one most likely will, have grounds to possibly go all the way to the Supreme Court. And that could possibly challenge Roe versus Wade. And I know many of the lawyers who have worked on these heartbeat bills, and various politicians and various advocates as well. And one of the things that they want to see happen is a constitutional challenge that challenges Roe versus Wade with one of these heartbeat bills coming out of any state. And why not have it come out of Texas? So I'm very excited about this one.
Absolutely. And if you're a part of one of these states, reach out to your representatives. Even if you're not, reach out to your representatives and tell them you want a heartbeat bill. Now, I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, but generally when a politician actually does something right, they're trying to cover up for something else. Or distract from something else. So I'm concerned Governor Abbott, some of these other governors are trying to distract from some other shenanigans they're doing. But hey, if it's getting us further in the fight for life, I'm all for it. But what are some other states that you know of that are implementing laws like this?
Well, many states, majority of states actually have brought in heartbeat bills. And as stated before, they've all been shot down. So I know that once a heartbeat bill has been proposed, it's then thrown back into the hopper, and various politicians will go to work on revising it. So you might see it come out of some more eastern states and some of the more Midwest states as well very shortly. But again, all these bills have been shot down up until this point.
That's the problem with executive orders, and these types of things where we're constantly, I think this is one of the biggest problems with the American church, is we're looking to one national figure, one state figure to fix all of our problems. This has to be a grassroots movement, from city council to school boards, just filling them with conservatives and believers. Do you think we're kind of missing it by putting all of our hopes and dreams in one national figure to sign an executive order that the next national figure can simply just remove?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've worked in federal, provincial, or what you would call state politics with these various politicians. And I also ran for city council. So I understand every level of government. And yes, you cannot place all your hopes or all your eggs in one basket. That's kind of ridiculous, to be honest. It's not sensical. So I would say that you need to have a global or national vision, but you need to act locally And acting locally is being involved. Become friends. Go volunteer with, whether it's other politicos or other individuals in your community who have the same values and beliefs, whether that's in a church or with an advocacy group, a pro-life group, a pro-life center, and then activate people within your community to go and volunteer and petition your local leaders and candidates. This is one tip that I give whenever I'm doing a political training is everybody go volunteer for any conservative candidate. Get in their good graces, become a friend, be that support, that individual who will always show up when they're asked to come. You will become that familiar face, and then you will have a direct line of communication, a voice into that candidate, whether it's a city councilor, whether it's a school board trustee, whether it's a federal politician or state politician. You need to show up continually. And as Christians, we're supposed to be salt and light in every area of our lives, and everything we do is supposed to be worship as to the Lord and to glorify him. And that includes how we spend our time, our money, our resources, and why not be involved in politics where those very policies are going to touch your life, your home, your church community.
Yeah, it's time to wake up. I know we want the easy solution just to kind of check the candidate we want, and hopefully that's going to fix it all. Those days are over. Just mark it in your mind, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to have to get involved. Just settle it right now. If we're going to revitalize a civilization, revive a nation, rejuvenate a generation, then we're going to have to rise up and get actively involved with our church, with local life groups, any way that we possibly can. And some of you watching, listen to me, you need to run for office. You need to run for the city council. You need to run for the school board. Some of you born-again lawyers need to become a judge somewhere and run for judge. It's time for you to take the position that God has ordained and called for you. Sister Mattea, you're such a source of truth, of information. People can always know what's going on. What's the best way for people to connect with you and your ministry?
Absolutely. So I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I am setting up a website, so you can find me in the next couple days. www.matteamerta.com, and I'll have my writings and different ways that we can connect with one another. But until that day comes, which will be very shortly, you can connect with me on social media.
Well, we have been waiting for you to get your website up and running, and when it is, we're going to post it on all of our social media sites, and we'll have you back on to talk about it. We're so thankful to have you in our lives and in the body of Christ. Mattea, thank you for joining us on Encounter Today.
Thank you. It's always an honor. God bless.
God bless. All of you watching, thank you for being with us here on Encounter Today. Don't forget to like this video, share it so other people can get this information. Let's get the word out. Let's let the church arise and watch her enemies be scattered. We'll see you next time right here on your Encounter Today.